There was a chain on the cave, and there was a chain on me, and on the morning I turned 15, both of them were about to break. The chain on the cave was iron, thick, rusted, looped 3 times through iron rings bolted into the limestone on either side of a wooden door set into a hillside in Watauga County, North Carolina. It had been there for 11 years, padlocked shut by a man named Ezra Boone, my great-grandfather, the week before he died in 1926. He had made the people of Sable Hollow promise never to open it. He had looked at each of them, the farmers, the shopkeeper, the preacher, the midwife, and he had said, "That cave is not for you. It's not for anyone alive today. When the right one comes, she'll know." And then he died, and the hollow kept its word, because in these mountains, people still honored the wishes of the dead, even when they thought those wishes were madness. The chain on me was different. Mine was made of silence and gray wool, and the rules of the evergreen home for girls in Asheville, where I had lived since I was 7 years old. My mother, Ezra's great-granddaughter, had died giving birth to my younger brother, who died 3 hours after her. My father, a man I barely remember, had left me on the steps of the evergreen home with a note pinned to my coat that said, "Her name is Ruth. I cannot do this alone." He went west. No one heard from him again. 8 years I lived behind those walls. 8 years of scrubbing floors and hemming dresses and being told that a girl's highest purpose was to be useful, quiet, and small. I was none of those things. I was the girl who stole colored chalk from the schoolroom and drew pictures on the backs of hymn sheets. The girl who mixed laundry bluing with dandelion juice to make green ink and wrote stories in the margins of old newspapers. The girl who once painted a mural on the dormitory wall using berry stains and mud and got locked in the cellar for 2 days as punishment, which was fine with me because the cellar had interesting mold patterns I hadn't seen before. I saw color in everything. That was my problem, according to the matron, Mrs. Shackelford. Ruth Boone sees the world in paint, she told the Board of Trustees once, as if this were a diagnosis. She needs to learn to see it in soap and thread like every other girl. The letter from the lawyer arrived on my 15th birthday. A man named Ezra Boone, deceased, had left his great-great-granddaughter a property in Sable Hollow, 6 acres of hillside, a cabin, and a sealed cave that nobody was permitted to enter. The lawyer noted, with the careful neutrality of his profession, that local residents considered the cave cursed, dangerous, or both. The girls at Evergreen didn't laugh. They whispered, which was worse. Cursed. A cursed cave for the cursed girl who painted on walls. If you want to find out why Ezra Boone sealed that cave with chains, and what I found inside that turned a curse into the most extraordinary gift anyone in those mountains had ever received, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what my great-grandfather hid in that hillside wasn't a danger. It was an explosion of color in a world that had gone gray. The bus left me in Boone, and a mail carrier named Otis drove me the last 18 miles into Sable Hollow in his truck. He was a lean man with kind eyes who talked the entire drive, which I was grateful for because the silence of the mountains was so absolute after 8 years of institutional noise that it frightened me. "Your great-granddaddy was something," Otis said, steering around a pothole the size of a bathtub. "Ezra Boone. People still talk about him. Not always kindly, but they talk." "What do they say?" "That he was an artist, a real one, not a Sunday painter. He came up here from Charleston in maybe 1910, bought the land, built the cabin, and spent the next 16 years doing something inside that cave. Nobody knew what. He'd go in at dawn and come out at dusk, covered in dust. Different colors every day. Red dust, yellow dust, blue dust. People thought he was mining, but he never sold anything, never shipped anything out. Just went into that cave and came out looking like a rainbow had fallen on him. And then he sealed it. 3 days before he died. Had the blacksmith make the chain specially, thick enough to anchor a boat. People figured there was something dangerous in there. Gas, maybe. Bad air. The mine inspector offered to check, but Ezra said no. Said it wasn't about danger. Said it was about timing. Otis glanced at me. Whatever that means. The cabin was at the end of a dirt track that climbed through sourwood and laurel to a shelf of flat ground about halfway up the ridge. It was small, but well built. Hewn log walls, stone chimney, a porch that looked out over the hollow toward the Blue Ridge in the distance. The view was staggering. On a clear day, you could see mountains folding into mountains until the blue haze swallowed them, and the light was the kind that painters spend their lives trying to capture. Golden in the morning, silver at noon, amber in the evening. The light alone was worth 6 acres. Inside the cabin, I found what I was beginning to expect from the relatives I'd never known. A life preserved in objects, a bed, a stove, a table. And everywhere, on every wall, every surface, every shelf, color. Jars of pigment lined the windowsills. Reds ranging from rust to crimson. Yellows from pale butter to deep gold. Blues from powder to midnight. Greens and purples and oranges, and a white so pure it looked like captured moonlight. There were brushes, dozens of them, made from hog bristle and horsehair, and something softer I later learned was squirrel tail. There were palettes stained with decades of mixing, and on the walls, hung in simple wooden frames, were paintings. Not ordinary paintings. These were landscapes of the hollow and the mountains beyond, rendered in colors so vivid, so impossibly saturated, that they seemed to glow from within. The greens were greener than any green I'd seen in the schoolroom paint box. The blues were deeper than the sky outside the window. The reds, a sunset over the ridge, painted in a red so rich it looked like the mountain was bleeding light, made me catch my breath. I looked at those paintings, and I looked at the jars of pigment, and I looked at the hillside behind the cabin, where a wooden door was wrapped in rusted chains, and I understood, before I even opened the cave, what Ezra Boone had been doing in there for 16 years. He had been mining color. I broke the chain on my 3rd day. Not because I was brave, because I was curious, and curiosity has always been stronger than fear in me, stronger than hunger, stronger than loneliness, stronger than the warnings of dead men and the whispers of living girls. I stood in front of that door for a long time on the 1st day, and a long time on the 2nd, listening to the hollow silence and the wind moving through the sourwoods and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something breathing behind the stone. Not a creature, not a ghost, but the cave itself, exhaling its cool mineral air through the gaps around the doorframe. The padlock was rusted solid. No key would have opened it after 11 years of mountain weather. I used Ezra's hand sledge, a short-handled hammer I found in the woodshed, and I hit the lock until it shattered. The chain fell away with a sound like bones dropping, and I pulled open the wooden door, and the smell that came out was not danger or death or poison. It was earth. Clean, mineral earth, the smell of stone and water and deep time. And underneath it, something else. Something faintly sweet, faintly sharp, like crushed flowers mixed with chalk. I lit a lantern and walked in. The entrance passage ran about 20 feet into the hillside, narrow and low, before it opened into the first chamber. And there, In the trembling lantern light, I saw what Ezra Boone had spent 16 years creating. The cave was a palette. The walls were striped with color, natural mineral deposits exposed and polished by Ezra's patient hand. Bands of ochre ran along the lower walls in shades from pale yellow to burnt sienna. Above them, a stratum of iron-rich clay blazed rust red, so vivid it looked wet. Higher still, where the limestone met a different geological layer, veins of blue-green copper carbonate, malachite, and azurite wove through the rock like rivers frozen in stone, and in pockets and crevices, in clusters and seams, were deposits I couldn't name, a purple so deep it was almost black, a white that sparkled with mica, a gold that caught the lantern light and threw it back doubled. But Ezra hadn't just found the minerals. He had built a workshop inside the cave to process them. Along the left wall, he had constructed a workbench from heavy oak planks, and on it sat a grinding station, a large flat limestone slab, a muller, and a series of smaller stones shaped smooth for crushing and grinding pigment. Beside the grinding station were sieves of different mesh sizes made from wooden frames and wire cloth, ceramic bowls for washing and settling, glass jars for storing finished pigment, wooden racks holding hundreds of dried pigment cakes, concentrated color pressed into small blocks and labeled in Ezra's handwriting with the source mineral and the date. The second chamber, deeper in the cave, was where the rarest colors lived. Ezra had followed the mineral veins into the hillside, carefully excavating without destabilizing the structure, and he had found deposits that I later learned were genuinely extraordinary. A seam of natural ultramarine, lapis lazuli, or something close to it, that produced a blue so intense it vibrated against the eye. A pocket of cinnabar that yielded a vermilion red of a quality usually found only in Chinese and Spanish deposits. And a mineral I couldn't identify at all. A soft, chalky stone that, when ground and mixed with linseed oil, produced a luminous green unlike anything I had ever seen, with a warmth and depth that synthetic greens couldn't touch. My great-grandfather had discovered a mountain full of painter's gold, natural pigments of museum quality, hidden inside an Appalachian hillside, waiting to be ground and mixed and turned into color that would outlast any factory paint by centuries, and he had sealed it with chains. The answer to why came on the fourth day, when I found the letter. It was in a tin box under the grinding bench, wrapped in oilcloth, addressed in Ezra's handwriting, for the one who breaks the chains. I opened it with hands that smelled of ochre dust. I had already begun grinding, unable to resist, and read, "If you are reading this, you have broken the lock. Good. The chains were never meant to keep the cave closed forever. They were meant to keep it closed until someone came who would use what's inside for the right reasons." I sealed the cave because a man named Garfield Tate offered me $2,000 for the mineral rights in 1925. When I refused, he threatened to take the land through tax liens. I sealed the cave and told people it was dangerous so that Tate would lose interest. A sealed cave with a curse on it is worthless to a man who wants to profit. It worked. He moved on to other schemes, but I was old and sick and I couldn't unseal it myself. The colors in this cave are not mine. They belong to the mountain. I spent 16 years learning how to take them without harm, how to grind and wash and settle pigment without poisoning the water, without collapsing the structure, without taking more than the cave can give back. My notes are in the red notebook on the shelf above the bench. Follow them. The mountain is generous, but not infinite. One more thing. In the third chamber, yes, there is a third, you will find what I consider my real work, not the pigments, not the paintings. Something I believe is more valuable than all the color in the world. You'll understand when you see it. Make something beautiful. That's all I ask. Ezra. A third chamber. I took the lantern and went deeper. The passage to the third chamber was narrow, barely shoulder width, and it curved downward for about 30 feet before opening into a space that was smaller than the first two chambers but taller, with a ceiling that rose into darkness above the lantern's reach, and every inch of that ceiling was painted. Ezra Boone had painted the cave, not the walls, the ceiling. He had built scaffolding. I could see the marks where it had stood, and he had lain on his back like Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, and he had covered the limestone ceiling with a painting so vast and so beautiful that I dropped the lantern and stood in darkness for 10 seconds before I scrambled to relight it because I could not bear to not see it. It was the hollow, Sable Hollow, seen from above, in every season. The painting spiraled outward from the center of the ceiling. Spring at the core, with dogwoods blooming white and red buds blazing pink. Then summer with its heavy greens and lazy creeks. Then autumn in a riot of orange and gold and crimson that made Ezra's jars of pigment look pale by comparison. And finally winter at the edges, the mountains white and silver and blue under a sky full of stars. It was a masterpiece. Not in the casual way people use that word, not pretty good or impressive for a self-taught mountain painter. A masterpiece, the kind of work that belongs in a museum, that scholars write books about, that changes the way people understand what art can be. And it was here, in a cave, in the dark, where nobody had seen it for 11 years. I sat on the cave floor and wept. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition that Ezra Boone, the crazy man on the ridge, the hermit, the fool, had been a genius, and he had hidden his greatest work underground because the world above wasn't safe enough to hold it. I spent the first year learning. Ezra's red notebook was a complete manual of pigment making. 200 pages of detailed instructions for extracting, grinding, washing, settling, and binding mineral pigments. He had developed techniques for each color. How to roast ochre to shift it from yellow to red. How to levigate azurite, washing and settling repeatedly, to separate the coarse, dark particles from the fine, brilliant ones. How to grind malachite slowly, because fast grinding heats the stone and dulls the color. How to bind pigments with linseed oil, with egg yolk, with gum arabic, with beeswax, each binder producing a different quality of paint. I followed his instructions with the reverence of a student, learning from a master. I ground my first ochre on his muller, working the stone in circles until the powder was fine as flour. I mixed it with linseed oil and painted a stroke on a piece of bark, and the color that emerged was alive, warm, deep, rich with the earth it came from. Nothing like the dead, chalky pigments in the schoolroom paint box at Evergreen. The first person to find me was Mama Pearl. Her real name was Pearl Suttles, and she was 73 years old, a weaver who lived in a cabin a mile down the hollow. She had known Ezra, more than known him. She had been his friend, perhaps his only one. She appeared at my door one morning in June with a basket of eggs and a look on her face that said she'd been waiting for this visit for 11 years. "You opened it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I opened it." "And you found the paintings?" "You knew about the paintings?" Pearl sat on the porch and told me. She and Ezra had been friends since the 1910s. She was a weaver, the best in the county, and Ezra had supplied her with natural dyes made from his pigments. His mineral colors, mixed into dye baths, produced tones in wool and cotton that no plant dye could match. Color fast, brilliant, permanent. Pearl's weavings, colored with Ezra's dyes, had won prizes at the state fair 3 years running. When he sealed the cave, "I lost my colors," she said. "I've been weaving with onion skins and walnut hulls for 11 years. They're fine, but they're not Ezra's colors. Nothing is." Pearl became my teacher in the ways Ezra's notebook couldn't be. She taught me how to convert mineral pigments into textile dyes, a different process than making paint, requiring mordants and fixatives and careful temperature control. She taught me weaving on her loom, a beautiful old thing made of cherry wood that sang when the shuttle flew through the warp. And she taught me something else, something more important: how to see color, not as decoration, but as language, as communication, as a way of saying things that words couldn't hold. "A blanket dyed with mountain ochre carries the mountain in it," Pearl told me once, holding up a skein of wool she dyed with my first batch of cave pigment, a warm golden yellow that glowed like lamplight. "The person who wraps themselves in this blanket is wrapping themselves in the ridge. That's not just color, that's belonging." By the second year, word had spread. I was producing pigments and dyes in quantities that went beyond my own use. The cave's deposits were extensive. Ezra had mapped them carefully, and following his notes, I found veins of ochre and iron oxide that could supply a lifetime of grinding. I sold pigments to painters in Boone and Blowing Rock, small jars of hand-ground color that artists recognized immediately as superior to anything from a factory. I supplied dyes to Pearl and to 3 other weavers she had trained, and their textiles, blankets, scarves, rugs woven in colors so vivid they stopped people in their tracks, began selling at craft fairs and mountain markets for prices that made the weaver's eyes go wide. But the real transformation came when Dr. Alice Herring arrived. Dr. Herring was a professor of art conservation at the University of North Carolina, and she had heard about my pigments from a painter in Asheville who had compared them favorably to historical European pigments. She drove up to Sable Hollow on a September morning, walked into the cave, and didn't come out for 4 hours. "Do you understand what you have here?" she asked me, standing in the second chamber with azurite dust on her fingers and wonder on her face. "These pigments, the ultramarine especially, are of a purity I've only seen in medieval manuscripts. Museums pay hundreds of dollars per ounce for natural ultramarine of this quality. Hundreds. Ezra sold it for nothing," I said. "Ezra didn't sell it at all. He used it. There's a difference." Dr. Herring looked at me. "And there's a painting in the back of this cave that needs to be seen by the world." I told her no, not yet. Not until I understood what Ezra would have wanted, which was not fame, not money, but something more careful than either. Dr. Herring respected my decision, but she came back. She came back every month for a year, bringing students, bringing colleagues, bringing art historians who stood in the third chamber and looked at Ezra's ceiling and were changed by it. She helped me catalog the mineral deposits. She tested my pigments in her university lab and confirmed their extraordinary quality and light fastness, the ability to resist fading, which exceeded modern synthetic pigments by a factor of 3. And she helped me build a business. The Boone Pigment Company, I named it after Ezra, not the town, was established in 1941. It was small by design. I produced pigments by hand, following Ezra's methods exactly, taking only what the cave could sustain. I sold to artists, to conservators restoring old paintings, to weavers and dyers across the Southeast. Pearl managed the textile side, training a growing circle of weavers in natural dyeing techniques. Dr. Herring connected me with museums that needed historically accurate pigments for restoration work. The war brought unexpected demand. The military needed durable, weather-resistant paints and dyes for equipment, uniforms, and, most urgently, camouflage. Factory-made synthetic pigments faded in tropical humidity within weeks, turning soldiers into targets. My mineral pigments didn't fade. They held their color in rain, in mud, in the relentless Pacific sun. A colonel from Fort Bragg drove to Sable Hollow in a Jeep in the summer of 1943 and asked me if I could supply pigment for camouflage paint in large quantities. "I can supply it in careful quantities," I said. "The cave gives what it gives. I don't take more." He didn't understand, but he agreed to my terms. For 2 years, I supplied mineral pigments for military camouflage paint, earthy greens, deep browns, muted yellows, that held their color in conditions that destroyed synthetic alternatives. The payments were modest by military standards, but transformative for me. I repaired the cabin. I built a proper workshop. I hired 2 young women from the Hollow to help with grinding and processing. Pearl died in the spring of 1945, at 81, on a morning so bright the mountains looked painted. I buried her on the ridge where she could see the hollow, and I wove her burial blanket myself on her cherry wood loom, using every color from Ezra's cave, ochre and sienna and ultramarine and malachite green and the vermilion red that she had called the color of a heart that knows it's loved. It was the most beautiful thing I ever made, and I buried it with her, because some things are not for the living. I married in 1946. His name was James Wilder, a carpenter from Avery County who came to Sable Hollow to build shelving for my workshop and stayed because he saw the ceiling. I took him to the 3rd chamber on our 4th meeting. I don't know why. Something told me he was ready, and he stood beneath Ezra's painting for 20 minutes without speaking. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet. "How is this here?" he said. "How is this in a cave?" "Because the man who painted it was told he was crazy," I said, "and caves don't judge." James understood the cave the way Pearl had understood color, intuitively, bodily. He built frames and scaffolding for the 3rd chamber that allowed visitors to view the ceiling properly. He constructed a lighting system using mirrors and reflectors that illuminated Ezra's painting without damaging the pigments. And he built me a proper studio above ground, a large, light-filled room with windows on 3 sides where I could paint, because I had started painting. Of course I had. I had been the girl who drew on hymn sheets and painted murals with berry stains. Now I had the finest pigments in America, and a cave full of color, and a ceiling painted by a genius to teach me what art could be. I painted the hollow. I painted the mountains. I painted Pearl at her loom, and James at his workbench, and the entrance to the cave with its broken chain lying in the grass like a dead snake. We had 2 children. They grew up knowing the cave the way other children know their backyard, intimately, casually, with their hands perpetually stained with pigment and their clothes perpetually marked with color. My daughter became a painter. My son became a geologist. Between them, they understood Ezra's cave from both sides, the art and the science, the beauty and the stone. In 1958, the state of North Carolina designated the cave a cultural heritage site. In 1963, an art historian from New York published a monograph on Ezra Boone's ceiling painting, calling it the most significant undiscovered American artwork of the 20th century. In 1967, a documentary crew filmed inside the cave, and millions of people saw what I had seen by lantern light 29 years earlier. the hollow painted on stone, spiraling through the seasons, made from the mountain's own minerals by a man the mountain had chosen to be its voice. James died in 1977, quietly, in the studio he'd built me, sitting in a chair with sawdust still on his boots. I buried him beside Pearl on the ridge. I kept painting. I kept grinding pigment. I kept following Ezra's red notebook and taking from the cave only what it offered freely. My hands knew the muller the way a pianist knows keys, the circular motion, the steady pressure, the moment when the powder becomes fine enough to hold light instead of scattering it. I died in 1984 at 62. They found me in the cave, in the third chamber, sitting beneath the ceiling with a jar of ultramarine in my hand. That impossible blue, ground from stone, deeper than any sky. My daughter said I was smiling. My son said I looked like someone who had finally become part of the painting. The cave is still open. The pigments are still being produced, carefully, sustainably, by my granddaughter and a small team of apprentices who grind by hand the way Ezra taught me through his notebook, and I taught them through mine. The ceiling painting is illuminated now by gentle electric light, and thousands of people visit each year to stand beneath it and feel what I felt at 15. That color is not decoration. Color is life. Color is the mountain speaking in a language older than words. Above the cave entrance, where the iron rings still hold the remnants of Ezra's broken chain, there is a plaque. It reads, "Ezra Boone sealed this cave with chains. Ruth Boone Wilder broke them. What was inside was never a curse. It was a gift waiting for hands brave enough to receive it." So let me ask you this. What chains are you standing in front of? What door in your life has been locked? By fear, by someone else's warning, by the whispered consensus that whatever's inside isn't worth the risk? What color have you been told doesn't exist? What beauty have you been told you can't create? What part of yourself have you been told is too strange, too impractical, too much? Because here's what Ezra knew, and what I learned the day I picked up that sledgehammer. The chains are never there to protect you from what's inside. They're there to protect what's inside until you're ready. The cave doesn't need the chains. You do, until you don't. Until the moment comes when curiosity is stronger than fear, and you swing the hammer, and the lock breaks, and the door opens, and the color hits you like a wave. The world will tell you to be useful, quiet, and small. The world will tell you that painting on walls is a waste, and that caves are cursed, and that girls who see everything in color need to learn to see in soap and thread. The world is wrong. It has always been wrong about this. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the chains you haven't broken and the colors you haven't found, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who picked up the hammer and opened the door. Your cave is waiting. The chains are old. They'll break easier than you think. And what's inside is more beautiful than anyone told you was possible.